The hum of the P-8A Poseidon settled low in the bones, a mechanical thrum that no one noticed after the first hour. Over the North Pacific, the horizon was a hard line of cold gray broken only by scattered sunlight slicing through overcast skies. Inside, the air smelled of metal, electronics, and rehydrated coffee slowly cooling in stainless steel mugs wedged into Velcro mounts. Chief Petty Officer Grace Nolan sat at the acoustic workstation closest to the fuselage bulkhead, her headset balanced lightly over both ears. She barely blinked as a new sweep rolled across her screen, waves of blue and green threading through noise. The room behind her buzzed with quiet voices and operational chatter. Someone cracked a joke about chow rotation. Someone else asked if the weather over Sector 3 had cleared. Grace adjusted the gain slightly, dialing down upper band resonance. A faint pulse stood out, low frequency, nearly subsonic, buried just beneath ambient scatter. She froze it mid-scroll and replayed the last 10 seconds. It repeated 2 soft pulses, evenly spaced, not mechanical, not drift scatter. It had rhythm, familiar in the way that something once studied but long filed away can feel like a whisper through memory. The display flagged it as biogenic, probably a humpback whale. The onboard classifier suggested. Common for this region. Grace didn't move. Her fingers tapped through filter presets, narrowing the band, pulling out thermal offset. The pulse remained. Not louder, not clearer, just consistent. That was enough. Behind her, a young sensor tech leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking toward a different console. Grace knew he hadn't noticed it. The system hadn't either. It shouldn't have. She marked the file locally. 1432, Sector Delta 5. She didn't speak. No protocol required her to act unless the system tagged it. Nothing in the SOP for unflagged anomalies unless paired with acoustic reinforcement from a separate node. She reached for the notebook stowed beside the panel and flipped past a dozen hand-drawn graphs until she found an empty corner. 3 lines of notation, 1 bracket, a sharp peak in harmonic rise circled in red ink. The crew was rotating stations. The junior AWO from the previous shift slid past her, gave a curt nod, then focused on the radar display. Grace stayed where she was. On the next loop, the signal repeated. The shape hadn't changed. It didn't scatter under shallow drift like a fish school. It didn't wobble like equipment noise. She magnified the envelope and slowed playback. Phase drift appeared on the 3rd cycle. It was subtle, but intentional. Each pulse rode a clean carrier frequency just outside thermal deviation. Grace had seen this before, long ago during an evaluation run off the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. But that was another lifetime, another system, before the classifiers took over. The flight officer up front, Lieutenant Danner, was telling a story too loudly. Something about an old sea trial and a power outage in Yokosuka. Laughter rolled back through the cabin, half distracted. The aircraft moved steady on patrol. Engines smooth. Nobody else was watching sonar. Grace copied the waveform, saved it with a local tag and archived it under legacy analysis. She didn't notify command. Not yet. Let the system catch up first. The shape lingered on her screen, pulsing quietly. Same tempo, same depth, same lack of deviation. Another sweep came in. She ran an overlay, checked for Doppler artifacts. None. She muted her headset briefly to catch the natural hum in the cabin. Nothing matched what she heard in her feed. A soft voice behind her asked if she wanted coffee. She didn't answer. The question passed. Grace looped the waveform once more and looked at the newest return. If this was just background noise, then it was the cleanest noise she'd ever seen. Her fingers hovered over the comms panel. Then she dropped them and went back to her notes. On sweep 4, the signal climbed slightly, by 0.07 hertz. Grace noticed because she had narrowed the window. The system didn't alert. It still believed it was hearing whale chatter. She scribbled another line in her notebook. Next to it, a phrase too clean to be random. The operator at the forward station leaned back. Their eyes met briefly, and Grace offered the faintest nod, one that meant everything and nothing. The other operator returned it, then turned away. They hadn't heard what she'd heard. The system had taught them not to listen that way anymore. When Sweep 6 arrived, Grace saved a second snapshot. She marked a timestamp and quietly typed a note into her local log. No broadcast, no escalation, just a folder name, Passive Drift, Subdelta, Grace only. The aircraft turned gently east. Sunlight bounced off the water below, scattering across the display like static. The rest of the crew had forgotten the sweep already, but Grace hadn't. And somewhere below, 2,000 feet of water, a signal repeated, quiet, rhythmic, and wrong in exactly the kind of way that made her stay very, very still. They used to ask her to explain the difference between passive echo and structural rebound. In the early years, Grace Nolan spent most of her time in briefing rooms, sketching waveforms on whiteboards while younger techs took notes. She'd helped write the original detection model for Pulse A7, back when sonar tracking still allowed room for human judgment. That protocol had been designed to catch what machines couldn't. Long, low-frequency drift buried under thermal scatter. Grace could read it like weather. It was the kind of thing that only showed up once or twice a deployment, and never the same way twice. It had taken years to refine, and just months to decommission. When the Navy moved to machine learning classifiers and AI-filtered spectrums, the A7 protocol was deemed too slow, too interpretive. Grace had been reassigned, gently at first. Fewer meetings, less input on platform updates. Then one day her ID no longer logged into the dev server. She didn't complain. She still ran her own checks. When they pulled her from the modeling unit and sent her to operational fleet rotations, she packed her notebook and kept it close. That notebook had traveled through 2 oceans and 4 ships. The pages were filled with curve sketches, signal notes, odd pulse sequences and margin scribbles that only she could interpret without a legend. At first, she still submitted her findings, old habits from technical briefing days, but most of the new officers didn't bother reading them, not because they were hostile, just because the system told them they didn't need to. The software handled detection. The human role was compliance. She adapted. Grace never stopped logging, even when they stopped asking. Even when her duty list shrank to acoustic monitoring and passive stack observation, she still noted the anomalies. Some part of her always ran the background math. She'd trained herself to hear microfluctuations in echo stability. It wasn't something you could teach anymore. She remembered the day the classifier misread a microtremor near the Aleutian shelf. The system flagged it as mineral resonance. Grace had matched it to a 2-year-old pattern from a drone sub-trial logged in her archive. She'd passed it up. Nothing came of it. Still, she logged it again. Now she sat near the far bulkhead of a patrol plane, headset cupped against one ear, letting signal patterns wrap around her thoughts. It wasn't nostalgia. It was muscle memory. Grace didn't miss the meetings or the briefings. What she missed was being listened to. She flipped open her notebook and tapped her pen once on the edge. The sketch she had drawn 7 years ago looked almost like the signal she'd seen that morning. Not identical, but close. The type of close that meant something if you knew where to look. The type of close machines weren't designed to find. Most of the younger sailors barely noticed the black-bound pad she always carried. It looked like any other logbook, but to Grace, it was a live archive, a record of echoes the system had forgotten. Some pages smelled faintly of seawater. Others held notations from a midnight shift halfway across the Atlantic. She knew them by feel. She wasn't bitter. She knew how the system worked. Technology replaced memory, but memory didn't disappear. It just waited. When Grace touched that signal, that low double pulse sitting too neatly in the noise floor, she didn't hear a wail. She heard something shaped, something that didn't belong, and for a moment, She wasn't just the quiet operator in the back row. She was the woman who remembered how it used to work. Lieutenant Marcus Danner leaned against the edge of the bulkhead, arms crossed, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. His voice cut across the low murmur of the operations bay with the kind of casual sharpness that carried weight even when wrapped in humor. "You still chasing ghosts in the noise floor." "Chief." Grace didn't look up. Her fingers moved across the control interface, isolating the signal again, marking a soft pulse that showed no biological curve. The waveform held steady. Her headset was already back in place by the time Danner spoke again. He gestured toward her display with the relaxed arrogance of someone who believed in the system more than the operator behind it. If the AI didn't catch it, it's not worth chasing. But I guess some people still need to feel like they're in the loop. Someone behind him chuckled, not cruelly, just enough to agree without stepping forward. The moment lingered. A tech at the rear station tapped a key louder than needed. The air in the cabin didn't shift, but something in it dulled. Danner didn't press. He didn't have to. He'd made his point. Grace circled a value in her notebook. 1504, slight phase offset, sub-band symmetry. She made a small bracket beside the entry and turned the page with a steady hand. Danner pushed off the wall and strolled forward, voice fading into a half-formed joke about sonar poetry and retirement plans. No one stopped him. No one pushed back. Grace adjusted the gain again. Not to hear better, but to silence the room just enough. She saved the overlay with a private tag and tucked the notebook back into its panel slot. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Let the system listen to itself. She was listening for something else. Grace spotted it again at 0946. The return drifted across the lower band, barely registering above ambient noise. Tucked beneath a sweep of whale song, the system flagged and dismissed in one cycle. She muted the classifier overlay and toggled the filter to manual, narrowing her range to 2.5 kHz with a shallow notch between 1.8 and 2.1. The pulse was still there. 2 beats. Clean separation. Too exact for a mammal. Too controlled to be tectonic. She magnified the waveform, overlaying phase drift markers across the last 3 cycles. Each peak lined up with less than 0.3 hertz of deviation. Biological signals don't do that. Grace had mapped these patterns before, back when the fleet still trained human analysts to spot synthetic masking. The current systems didn't flag low harmonic anomalies unless paired with thermal elevation or proximity trigger. This one showed neither, just a consistent signal trying not to be seen. She opened her encrypted folder and pulled the last saved file from 2 weeks prior. Same cadence, same amplitude. She slid the temporal alignment window and synced both returns. They clicked into place with a quiet inevitability. The anomaly was back, and it hadn't changed, which meant it wasn't weather, wasn't wildlife, and wasn't random. Her right hand reached beneath the panel slot and pulled out her notebook. The edges were soft from years of travel. Grace flipped through marked pages, skipping past North Sea echoes and Atlantic shelf scans until she reached the sketch she'd logged in 2017. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was close enough that she stopped and held it next to the screen. The curve she had mapped years ago followed the same rise-fall pattern, now glowing in green across her monitor. She circled the peak drift with a red pen and noted the decay slope matched within 4%. Her gut had been right then. It was right now. She saved the current capture under a legacy tag and enabled the deprecated protocol menu. Pulse A7 hadn't been used in 6 years, but she hadn't removed it from her personal toolkit. The old framework loaded with a flicker, slower than the newer classifiers but still functional. She fed the active waveform into the sequence and watched the system begin correlation. First pass came back at 48%, second jumped to 67%, third locked at 81.2%. The acoustic signature matched the baseline model for artificial masking. It used phased harmonics, designed to mimic oceanic movement, but with one critical flaw. It was too consistent. Real ocean sounds drift. Grace leaned closer to the screen and tagged the result as shaped pattern. Legacy class. She didn't alert command. Not yet. If she filed it through normal channels, it would sit in queue until next shift rotation. The anomaly didn't have that kind of time. She opened a blank section of her notebook and traced a fresh copy of the current waveform. Her hands moved steadily. She added the timestamp and location reference. Then she underlined one word below it. Deliberate. Grace didn't look away from her screen. The pattern had held through 5 sweeps. Same rhythm, same signal-to-noise ratio. She double-checked the propagation path and drew a small arc across her notebook, connecting the current contact zone to a shelf corridor 60 nautical miles north. If the signal kept its drift vector, it would vanish under thermal shadow before the end of the next cycle. She opened a buried menu beneath the comms interface, one not used in regular operations anymore. The legacy simulator routing tool had no label, just a line of numerical identifiers she still remembered from when she helped write the test logic. It wasn't for live operations. It was built to feed movement data into fleet training sims without pinging alert systems. Grace entered a dummy beacon channel, one still technically active but no longer linked to mission-critical routing. She embedded a new trajectory into the metadata packet, encoded with drift timing and vector shift. It wouldn't trigger a fleet-wide broadcast. But if the carrier picked it up in background sync, it would register as a small deviation from nearby training buoys, just enough to justify a course adjustment. Her fingers moved fast but quiet. She used old formatting tags that hadn't been touched in years. When she hit send, nothing changed on her screen. That was by design. The simulator menu ran in passive mode. The signal routed silently. 90 seconds passed before a junior tech at the forward console frowned at his map overlay. Hey, Belmont just shifted heading. 10 degrees to port. That wasn't in the patrol log, was it? Heads turned. Someone checked the ops terminal. Someone else confirmed the deviation. No beacon report had been received. The maneuver wasn't flagged as authorized. Lieutenant Danner stood. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the route map. That's a live carrier. Who issued that correction? He turned toward Grace, voice low but sharp. Did you send something? Grace kept her eyes on the sonar feed. The signal had already begun to fade under the outer band. She turned just slightly toward him. The signal couldn't wait for clearance. Danner's face tightened. You used an obsolete beacon to spoof a reroute. You have any idea what that does to the chain of command? Grace didn't blink. I didn't spoof anything. I used a simulation protocol still logged under operational support. If command checks the routing log, it'll show a training update ping, no alerts, no breach, just metadata. The room fell quiet. One of the analysts near the rear console whispered that the vector was stable and aligned with a potential intercept point. Danner stared at her. You're not cleared for that kind of decision. She closed her notebook and placed it flat on her console. I didn't make a decision. I offered a solution. You can call command and ask them to undo it, or you can wait and see if that signal comes up for air. No one moved. Grace adjusted her headset and returned to the waveform. The signal was weaker now, but still present, and the Belmont, now arcing slowly north, was on the right path. At 11:03, the lookout reported a silhouette off the port bow. Visibility was poor fog clung to the surface like wet cloth, thick and shifting with each swell. Bridge personnel moved with trained efficiency, but their voices carried an edge not usually heard during routine watch. The object was less than 3,000 yards out, too close to have evaded radar unless deliberately masked. No AIS return, no acoustic pings from prior scans. It had come in quiet. The officer of the deck, Lieutenant Hartley, raised binoculars and gave a short, clipped call over the bridge intercom. Visual contact confirmed. Bearing 075. Vessel unknown. No running lights. Low profile. He turned to the tactical display. Sea State 5. No Allied operations scheduled in the area. The contact sat just outside the western edge of the exclusion zone. Quartermaster began logging the sighting. Combat Information Center cross-referenced known vessel profiles. Nothing matched, not even close. The hull line was sharp, almost unfinished, and the tower sat too far forward. No signal buoys, no markings, no wake. Bellomont's Teo initiated a surface contact report and moved to ThreatCon Bravo. Bridge crew moved to General Quarters 1 without alarm sirens. Quiet readiness. The ship shifted under their feet as propulsion responded to new heading orders. Slow port turn to maintain offset vector. Communications attempted a bridge-to-bridge hail. No reply. Channel 16 remained open and dead. The fog made it worse. What looked like a silhouette at first now appeared to move slightly out of phase with the swells, as if adjusting without propulsion. Lieutenant Hartley ordered Rule 6 assessment collecting radar, sonar, ESM, and EOIR data to identify vessel intent and capability. Within 3 minutes, the contact had closed another 500 yards without changing profile. One of the fire control technicians flagged an infrared return inconsistent with traditional exhaust. There was no plume, no temperature differential, just a heat mass low to the waterline, shifting unnaturally smooth. CIC raised a red indicator on the local command net. Unclassified term, ghost hull. It meant the contact didn't fit. A training term for something that couldn't be categorized but was clearly there. Hartley relayed a verbal sitrep to Strike Group Command. Target bearing and range, movement erratic, no ID, awaiting direction. Across the bridge, someone muttered that it didn't look like anything from the Russian or Chinese surface libraries. The image enhancement team pushed a high-resolution snapshot. Hull composite material didn't match known stealth coatings. No radar dome. No mast. Just angles and dark gaps. Hartley kept his voice even. Maintain observation. Do not engage unless fired upon. Secure all electronic emissions. Update tactical overlay every 30 seconds. The fog shifted again, and for a moment the entire form of the vessel emerged sleek, unnatural, matte-skinned and silent. No one said a word. Then it faded back into the mist, like a memory. And still, it hadn't broadcast a thing. At 12:11 the routing trace came back clean. No breach flag, no unauthorized access. Just a dormant simulator protocol logged under an acoustic operator's credentials. It wasn't even encrypted. The tagline read, A7, Sim, Grace, Nolan. The room held still. A captain leaned over the workstation and read the packet header again. Slower this time. Another officer scrolled through the legacy registry. Pulse A7 wasn't just old. It was hers. She had written the injection method during the 3rd revision phase. Everyone in the room knew it now. The override didn't bypass anything. It just nested where no one looked anymore. Legal, logged, properly formed. The signal moved because she'd asked it to. Someone finally spoke. She didn't break anything. She just remembered. The screen showed the Bellomont's adjusted heading. On that course, they would have missed the contact entirely if not for the change. A few of the younger staff shifted in their seats. No one raised their voice. No one called it brilliance. It wasn't that kind of moment. The acting watch officer looked down at the confirmation signature again. They used to call that back door the ghost tap, didn't they? The old Sims. The old officer beside him nodded once. Yeah. And she still had the key. No one said her name. They didn't need to. The ramp dropped slowly under the P-8A's belly, creaking into place as the air outside settled cool and heavy on the tarmac. Grace Nolan stood near the rear bulkhead, her notebook already zipped inside the outer pouch of her kit bag. She ran one last systems check on her console, saved the flight logs, and signed out without comment. Nobody looked up. The crew was busy with post-flight chatter, paperwork, gear rechecks. She moved past them quietly. Her boots hit the steel ramp at 1842. Lights from the hangar washed the flight line in muted yellow. She didn't pause at the bottom. No backward glance. She walked toward the open hangar bay with the slow, steady pace of someone who'd carried weight long enough to know Not to rush its release. The wind tugged lightly at her collar. She adjusted nothing. Inside the debrief room, 20 minutes later, screens displayed overlays from the contact incident, sonar plots, IR captures, surface mapping. At the center of it all sat an envelope labeled Legacy A7G, Nolan. Inside were pages scanned from a personal archive, handwritten annotations, drift path estimates, low-resolution signal envelopes. One sheet, dated 5 years earlier, sketched a ghost hull signature nearly identical to what the Belmont had just recorded. A lieutenant held the sheet up beside the live telemetry still looping on screen. It's not a prediction. She mapped it. Years ago. The admiral leaned forward from his chair, hands clasped at his knees. He didn't speak. He traced the line on the projection with one finger, following the phase drift curve, the same one logged hours before the contact surfaced. There was no modeling error, no guesswork. The deviation vector was inside her notes, labeled if cloaked drift occurs. Simple handwriting, slanted, no underlines. One of the junior officers stepped back from the table and exhaled slowly. We didn't build around it because we didn't think it could exist. Another added, she never said it would. She just left a place for it. A commander scrolled through the archived folder, her tools still compiled. Her old protocol tags ran clean. Every diagram had contact markers labeled in legacy format, time-stamped and signed. There were no summaries, no PowerPoints, just maps and math. The admiral finally spoke. She gave us a frame. We never filled it in. No one replied. The silence felt appropriate. Out on the flight line, Grace set her bag down near a bench outside the ready room. She opened a thermos she hadn't touched all day and took a slow sip. The fog was starting to roll back in, hanging low behind the hangars. Her notebook stayed zipped. There would be more pages later. For now, she just let her shoulders rest. Behind her, a door opened. One of the sonar techs stepped out, held it for a second, then let it swing shut. He didn't say anything. She didn't look over. He just stood nearby, maybe 5 steps off, facing the dark. In the command room, the lights dimmed as systems went into overnight cycle. The last screen left on showed her routing signature from earlier in the day. Line tag, Legacy A7, path, override, status valid, timestamp matched to the moment the Belmont changed course. The old frame was still holding. Grace pulled off her gloves one finger at a time. She slid them into the narrow tray inside her locker, palm side up, the way she always did. No rush. Just the rhythm of a routine that had outlasted every system update. The locker door closed with a muted click. She didn't lock it. There was nothing inside worth stealing, nothing anyone else would want. A rolled-up notebook, a second pair of boots, one patch from a squadron long since decommissioned. Outside, the air had cooled. The wind came low off the water, pushing inland in steady pulls that lifted the edge of her collar. She didn't adjust it. The concrete under her boots felt uneven in places, old seams raised slightly from years of heat and wear. She walked over them like she had 1,000 times before. Floodlights lit the tarmac in wide cones. A crew in the distance moved around a parked tow tractor, their voices too far off to carry. Her steps didn't echo. Too much space, too much open sky. Each step landed soft but sure. There was no need for speed now, no timeline to match. She passed the last row of parked vans. Her shadow stretched ahead of her, long and loose. She didn't look back at the hangar. She didn't need to. What mattered had already happened, and not in any room she'd stood in. In the debrief center, her diagrams were probably still on the screen. Maybe someone was talking through them, circling data points she'd marked in ink. They could have the conversation now. The system would adjust. It always did eventually. Grace kept walking, past the end of the maintenance line, toward the edge of the compound where the lights gave way to dark. There were no salutes, no final words, just wind, concrete, and the slow settling of something old finding its shape again. The work had never been about being seen. Not really. It had been about listening carefully, consistently, even when no one else did. She had done that. And now, finally, so was the system. The operations tech sat alone at the terminal. It was 2014. Most of the shift had cleared out, leaving the admin bay quiet except for the hum of overhead lights and the soft clatter of a keyboard. He had been told to reinstate a legacy call sign tied to an acoustic specialist. No urgency, just a note from command. Reactivate for archive integration. He pulled up the credentials panel, keyed in the access string, and typed slowly, GN087 Pulse. For a second, the system lagged. Then a name populated beside the code. Nolan. Grace. Last active 11 months ago. Status dormant. He hesitated before pressing confirm. When the cursor blinked again, the status line changed. Active. He sat back in the chair and rubbed his palms together. There was nothing dramatic about the screen. No pop-ups, no sounds, just the name. Back in the system. Clean. Authorized. Tied to protocols he didn't fully understand. He didn't know her. Not really. He'd heard things that day. Bits and pieces. Mostly from the debrief channel. Something about an override. Something about a contact that shouldn't have been possible. But this part, right here, felt quieter than all that. Like flipping on a light in a room no one had entered in years. Somewhere in command, a policy draft was being revised. Her field sketches had made it into the doctrine loop, copied without fanfare into Phase 4 counter-stealth response. The source was noted, Nolan Archive, version 5. No one questioned the signature. It held. Back at the terminal, the tech opened the session log and saved his update. No one would see his name. That was fine. He glanced one more time at the screen before logging out. The name stayed lit, floating at the edge of the screen like it belonged there all along, not because the system remembered, but because someone finally did. Think about the graces in your own life, the ones who stay a little later, speak a little less, but carry more than most ever see. They're not chasing attention. They're paying attention. Maybe it's someone at work. Maybe it's someone in your family. Someone who doesn't raise their voice, but somehow still holds everything together when it counts. If this story made you think of them, tell us. Share their name. Leave a comment below and follow for more stories that honor quiet strength and earned trust. Some people don't need the spotlight. They just need the space to act when it matters.